let the very informal interview commence. So, Bloodchild by Octavia, we'll call her. Initial thoughts, impressions. What did you think?
Well, the first thing I thought was I was super disappointed at the end. There was some explanatory notes. Because I had some pretty big questions that I wanted to discuss, and then I was like, "Oh, this tells me about the author," and then it's like, "Oh, it tells me a lot about the story or how she perceived it." So, I
like spoilers even after you read it, sort of.
Which is kind of weird, right? Like, how could it be a spoiler if you've already read it? But no,
exactly.
True. My initial thoughts was, it was really, I read it before bed. I was like, oh, dang, I shouldn't have done that. It was gross and fairly vivid.
It's scary. Mm-hmm.
Caged. You've been caged. And so I guess my initial thoughts were sort of like, I tried to read a book by her once and I couldn't get into it. And so this was kind of like a better way for me to experience like what she writes and how she writes and some of the names. And I like how she never gives you anything. It's like, oh, is this character male or female? Oh, wait a minute. Is this character human? Or so I initially was like, this is why I gave up on that book. I don't know what's going on. And I was like, boy, that's lazy. I got to keep going. So I took a lot of notes, which helped me too. Like, even if they were just question marks, like, what's this preserve? Is it really more like a farm or a plantation or, So mainly I had questions when I read, not really strong feelings. What about you?
I'd say it was similar, and like for most of these, or almost everything I read now, I do the classic text-to-speech sort of a thing, and so it's a different experience when it's being read to you, and especially when it's not like an audio book where it's more like a robot voice, and like I've become like very accustomed to that, and on previous assignments where I've had readings, the voice plays into what you're experiencing way more than you might kind of imagine. And that speaks to like how we perceive things in the filter of our own mind when we're reading stuff. Like everything is so much, we think about things so much more when not just if it's in our own voice or whatever, but like whatever is like every factor plays into your experience when you're consuming media, sort of a thing. And so I did have some of the same stuff of I wasn't always entirely sure what was going on, because at least like everyone had like kind of unique names, so they're kind of weird names too, so like kind of caught you off guard. And especially when you have a robot voice reading, it doesn't always pronounce things the way you might kind of imagine or like could consistently do. So that was interesting, but I would say the little ending part helped me a lot more, because it kind of gave context to more abstract symbols that were harder to latch on if you weren't directly consuming it. So I found it helpful because there wasn't as much to spoil for me, because I didn't entirely understand it as it was going on. So it recontextualized stuff instead of like ruining the thought process for me. Because I don't know if I could have like thought through without understanding that part from what I got from like listening to it.
Yeah, okay. I agree with you. If I had just been reading it on my own, I would have been like, oh, that's so interesting. I didn't think of it that way. But since I knew we were going to discuss it, I was sort of like I thought, I don't really like book clubs, but I've tried to. But I do like it when you are able to talk about a book with somebody that you know, and you kind of help each other, like tease it out and be like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So I feel like the spoiler at the end maybe did some of the work you and I would have done discussing it.
Yeah. And that would have been interesting too, because I wasn't like planning on interviewing you after I did the initial reading. So I wonder if that's playing into my thoughts or how that works. But I guess we can. Do you have anything else further to speak on before we get into any questions here, or should we hop in
terms of like initial feelings or anything like that?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this interview is especially interesting because you are my mother, and the first question would be, would you consider me your blood child?
I definitely feel like a woman would read this story differently than a man. But I definitely, like, once I figured out that, like, it was about a guy giving birth in a sense, I was like, you always wonder as a woman, like, how would guys, like, react to being pregnant, like having something in you for 9 months? How would they, what would their war stories be after birth? Like, so, it was forever, or, I had this much help, or I didn't take any medication or whatever. So do I consider you my blood child? No.
No? Okay. And then I guess on top of that, like, clearly I was there for everything, but not very consciously.
Right.
What was your reaction to 9 months of labor?
I can very clearly remember when you came out being like, oh wow, it's a baby, duh. Like, I knew that. I mean, but for 9 months, it's part of you. And then at this moment, you're like, oh wow, it's, this being now, even though a baby, an infant, a newborn is completely reliant on the mother, you're still like, this is a separate entity. We are no longer like, so yeah, one, like, being surprised it was a baby, like, wow, that's stupid. But again, it's a new way. And just, that you're going to love your child, but it's a whole other, like, a depth of a bond. And also, like, after taking you home and, like, Dad and I being so sleep deprived and everything, us being like, oh my God, this is so much responsibility. Like, just utterly being not unprepared, but mentally unprepared for, like, okay, how do you do this? That kind of thing. No matter how much I read, and we read a lot, and I took classes before you were born, all this stuff, still being completely overwhelmed by what it means to be responsible for another dependent person.
And then I guess, like, since you brought Dad up, I was curious, do you feel like, clearly you can't, like, answer exactly for him, but do you think the weight on his shoulders felt like more or less, or like equivalent to, of like what the process was next, or do you, like, feel like he was kind of there to, like, carry, I don't want to call myself, like, a burden, but, like, carry like the weight of what was happening at the same time? And in the context of the story, do you think even if, like, the physical aspects of how the characters change, would the amount of responsibility kind of feel the same? Like, if you were kind of in Dad's position, maybe that, to simplify, like, would you have felt as much pressure in, like, an ideal world where, like, everyone is kind of contributing their best?
There's a lot of questions in that, what you just said. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess before we had you, we were at, like, I don't know, I think it was a parenting class or something, and the teacher asked the people in the group, the parents to write down, like, what they were most excited about having a child. And I wrote down, like, some, to help a person come into the world and develop good character and pursue their dream, really very much me. And then Dad wrote down to have fun with them. And I remember looking at him being like, that's all? And he's like, well, yeah, I think it'll be really fun. Like, and I was like, okay, that's it was cool. So that was helpful for me to think about what we were both going into, like the preconceived ideas about what it means to be a parent and what it would be like. And then once we had our first child, I really realized, like, maybe this is sexist, but it's different for a woman, especially if she's going to breastfeed the baby. Like, my whole life was so different. Everything about my body was different. And then for a guy, it's a lot of sleep deprivation and a lot of, I can do a whole bunch of things, but I think for a woman, at least for me, I was probably more greatly impacted because I, like, wanted everything on my own in my bed, that kind of thing. So it's probably hard for him because I can be overbearing in that concern, but at the same time, it's just different for your life and your body. And he had a new job, and he had to, get as much sleep as he could and be good at his job to provide for us. So different roles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then.
But especially because, or it sounds like what you're saying is like there's gonna be like the mental aspect in battle for everyone, but like just through the physical grounds of reality, like for a woman, like that's a necessary part that they have to go through too. That like it's gonna be like equally mentally as straining, but like just the physical part, it's just a whole different set of experiences that like no job or anything could prepare you for. And like no matter what the man is working through, like 200-hour weeks or whatever, it's just a very different world of work you have to go through. So
100%. Yeah.
All right, very interesting. And then I would ask, I guess it's certainly different in a first world country, but when you were pregnant, do you feel like there was any form of this being like a sacrifice per se, or like where would it always be in mind where like, oh, if there wasn't any complications, like save the mother through the process of birth, or was it not as like a primary concern, knowing like the medical care that you could get, there's like a much lower risk of like you losing your life in this process?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I'm out of loop, obviously, about how women feel now, but at the time that I was pregnant and in the place that I was, California and like the Bay Area, I had kind of adopted the thinking that like I didn't want an epidural, which is like an anesthesia during childbirth. I wanted to do a natural method, and I knew people that were going to doulas, which is like a woman, like a midwife that delivers your baby in a special birthing center and all this stuff. And I was like, no, if there's any complication, like I want like really great machines near me. You know what I mean? So like I felt incredibly spoiled that I had these options. And I never really felt like my life was in danger, but I'm also super, I had to focus on like preventative, like trying to be really healthy throughout the pregnancy. And I went to all my checkups and, had, God, I can't think of the word. Anyways, had the baby checked multiple times, and I had the option of having some checks done to see if the baby possibly had birth defects. And I'm like, yes, I want to know that. And all these things came out like positive and kind of set me up that childbirth would be, typical process, not easy, but at least like I had a lot of info. And like you said, I had a lot of medical options, being not just in the US, but in like a really pretty wealthy area. So I had really good access to things.
Like covering all your bases was like a really great mental insurance to not have to worry about like, oh, this won't be like a major trade-off or anything, but I can go into this very confidently.
Yeah.
And that's like probably a part that maybe isn't as identifiable in Bloodchild, where it's like you knew I was gonna have to be like ripped out of your stomach, or like I wasn't gonna be like a little leech crawling around under your skin if things went wrong or whatever.
Exactly.
That wasn't like a parallel that you kind of experienced. Like, oh, I was afraid he was gonna stay in my body forever and transform me as a little locust.
Right,
like,
exactly.
As a non-issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I had kind of a pie in the sky vision too. I was like, well, just go into labor and the water will break and everything will be great. And once I started having contractions and things, I was like, oh, this really hurts. And this isn't happening as quickly as I hoped it was. And then when after, I don't know what, 12 hours, I was thinking, okay, is this child like not going to come out, or what's happening? And that's when I was like, so happy I was in a hospital and I could say, yeah, I would like to get that epidural. Can you get the anesthesiologist in here? And so like just all these things, like you said, like setting myself up and knowing I had options. At no point did I feel like, yeah, exactly, like an adversarial relationship with the baby or the process or whatever. I felt more like I had a whole team on my side. Yeah.
Do you feel like I was on your team when things are happening, or no?
I thought you were very comfortable and maybe like, you know what, I'm good. I don't really need to go out into this world. Yeah, I was like, oh, this kid.
Just chilling. So, almost to backtrack a little bit, would you, if, and I hit like doing back in time type questions because like you've done so much work through everything, but maybe like if you were to go back in time and have your memory wiped or something like that, if you could, or if you and Dad traded positions, not like he being the woman, but like he being the person to carry the child, do you think you would still be able to have the perspective you have right now of understanding what you've gone through and like still be kind of empathetic to the situation, or do you think only through what you've experienced can you understand what has happened, or can you learn through other people's stories the magnitude of what you feel?
Oh gosh, I think you need the experience. Because I mean, and that's not necessarily like just based on pain or anything too. I mean, I knew I would love my kids, but I really did not understand like how deep that bond is. Like, yeah. So I mean, I feel like I read lots of stories about, you know, people love their kids, and you know, I saw my parents love me and whatever. But it's like, I don't think you could prepare me for that. The actual emotion of it, of just like, wow, okay, this is, you know, this is a big deal. So you can definitely learn from things, but to me, there's really nothing like that experience.
So was it worth it?
100%, yes.
Okay. Those are all the main questions, and the last one I want to wrap up with is, how do you feel the quote "giving birth to the earth" translates to this reading?
I think that makes that quote have more depth than I've ever thought before, since, you know, a lot of the stuff in the story, I guess it was super significant to me that near the end, the author really makes it clear that the character, and I've kind of forgotten his name, was willingly going to be involved. Like, I thought that was really important. And so giving birth to the earth, because at the end it says something like, would you have destroyed yourself? I guess I thought that was interesting. Like, to a certain extent, like this character, that was their destiny, because the mom agreed very early to prepare, fatten up, basically, her son for the worm creature thing. And the brother kept trying to run away, but then he realized he was like trying to run away, but he was actually inside a cage the whole time. So I thought that was super interesting. So, you know, give birth to the earth, maybe that's just destiny. And so it's better to accept that willingly.
Yeah.
You've been deep for years, and I just didn't even realize how deep that saying was.
Exactly, yeah. Giving birth to the other holds a lot of weight to it, so that's that basically.
Yeah, that is.
Not sure if anything needs to be said more on this topic.
It's pretty much life. Here lies Matthew Keller, and he gave birth to the earth.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say? Any questions for me? If you want to, you know, see how the turntables turn.
Well, yeah, I was curious, like, how a man would read this story. Like, you know, if it's basically, like she says, it's my pregnant man story. Like, how did you feel about that? Was it disgusting to you, or like, whoa, that's weird? Or as a man, have you thought about that? Like, what would be like if I was the one responsible for carrying on a generation? What do you think?
Yeah, it's. I think it was almost like you were saying, where like you can understand or empathize and understand other people's situations, but like without actually going through the process, it's hard to understand the weight of what's actually happening. And so I think it's easy for a lot of people to say, or anyone to say like, oh, I could flip the script and fulfill this role and be the sacrifice or carry on this generation, but without going through it and understanding the actual impact, you can't really confidently say that. And so I think given different circumstances, like anyone could really step up to the plate for whatever is really happening, and if that was like the social norm, then it would be normal. But of course the thing in this situation is like it's like a very weird process that the male is the host, where it's not like, oh, this is just what happens, but it's like taking real normal humans of today and forcing the process on them. And so reading it as a guy, it seems weird, but maybe not unfeasible. I don't know if it would be able to be like, if I could like say it's uncomfortable, because it's hard to understand like the importance of what is happening, because like you're saying, you kind of gotta like walk the walk to talk the talk of it. So like you can say you understand, or like, oh, this is gonna be like super crazy to actually go through, but going through the motions of it is a much different story. So like, yeah, I kind of get it. Like I understand how weird it is, but like if I'd actually having it happen or something even similar, it's hard to say what your reaction would be. It almost just stays like science fiction without anything further. So
because it's not like I don't know, two mammals, same species, and having pleasure through sexual intercourse. It's really more not a sacrifice, but there's a certain amount of, I don't know what you want to call it, like duty or something involved. So so I don't think it's like a great transfer in that way for a man, but just the idea of with the physical duty and responsibility to carry on, it was interesting. Did you like the story?
It was okay. I think I liked it after I like went through the theme thing. As I was saying before, like kind of understood more, and I thought it was interesting when she was talking about like the bot flies thing. I was like, oh, I've related to that, of like how something is like so gross that maybe you just have to like push through it to not accept it, but like just kind of like get over it in a way. Or like it's a very face your fears approach to like talking about something that like makes your skin crawl. So that was like probably the most relatable thing out of me for the entire reading, of like, oh yeah, this is very gross, and I don't like that. But any further than that, I feel like it's kind of a passable story for me, just because it like it didn't grab me the way other readings have, or it wasn't as like realistic seeming, so I couldn't wrap my head around it. Like maybe it could have been cool if instead of being like aliens and stuff, like it was, you know, real humans on Earth, and like there was some weird complication or like medical or like a new medical thing came out that did allow males to give birth or something. Like maybe having like a regular science advancement would have made it more persuasive for the regular reader to kind of make them think, oh, this is like feasible and I can like empathize with this more. But without with it being like on a different planet and like these sci-fi sort of names, I think it's harder to care about what is happening other than it just being a story.
I agree. I read a novel that had a similar idea. It was called The Mount, and it's science fiction, and these creatures are blobby and can't move, and they use humans as like their horses basically. And it was, I just really enjoyed it because it made me think about like, basically, I think she says this near the end, like what if there's something that humans can provide for another species that they don't have, and that it's not a symbiotic relationship where they both benefit, but to be used. And so I like that concept. I think it really makes me think, and that's when I really like science fiction. It makes me think kind of like, well, I always think, wow, humans were so advanced, whatever, what if we're just somebody else's, tool for something? So I think it has that benefit, but yeah, maybe I got stuck on some of the names and the Tulik and then Tulik and like, was that necessary? Did it add anything? I don't know. But yeah, I do like it when science fiction makes me like rethink my assumptions. So okay. Yeah, it didn't make me want to read anything else by her though. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
That's I was like, oh, too bad. Oh well. At least I read something by her. Thank you though. That was fun.
Thank you too, everyone. This has been my mother, Katie Tallern, the wonderful guest and birther to me, and so that's why she's a great subject for this. I don't even think I introduced you at the beginning, but maybe I'll do another little segment of that. But thank you so much, and I'll see you when I see you.
Okay. Bye. See ya.